Hello and welcome. My name is James Ker-Lindsay and welcome to the latest viewer questions. Ben1234 asks, if the UK were to rejoin the European Union, would it be able to keep the pound and stay out of the Schengen area, given that its previous opt-outs are still set out in treaties such as the Maastricht Treaty and the Treaty of Amsterdam? Ben, I think you ask a really great question here, because this is obviously a really interesting point. So look, there are two parts to this, or two approaches, I should say, to this. So the first is that you could take a very legalist point of view and say, look, these were written into previous treaties that still remain in force, even though Britain has left the European Union. So there could be an argument that if Britain were to decide to rejoin, and for regular channel viewers, they know my views on this, that, you know, I really do hope that one day it does decide that it rejoins. But if it were to rejoin, it could say, look, these were the opt-outs that we had when we were previously a member. They're written into treaties. We want to go back in with those opt-outs in place. That's a possibility, but I don't think it's going to happen. And personally speaking, I certainly wouldn't want it to happen. And I think that it's very unrealistic, because ultimately any decision to rejoin the European Union is going to have to involve a decision by the European Union, by the members, on whether they want to have Britain back. So Britain can say, listen, we want to come back, but it will be the members that will look at the situation and make their assessment as to whether they want it. And I think that one of the things that really harmed Britain's relationship in the past with the European Union was this sense of difference, this sense of exceptionalism, that it had carved out more opt-outs than any other member state. We weren't just talking about, for example, Schengen, which is one that you raised, and the euro, but it had a very, what was effectively an opt-in on justice and home affairs issues. So many issues that could do with sort of like police cooperation and things. In actual fact, when the EU formulates those policies, Britain is given the right to decide that it doesn't want to be part of it. And this was far more than any other member state. And I think that it also did a lot of damage in Britain's relationship with the rest of Europe. And there was this sense that Britain was sort of half in, half out, that it really never committed to the European Union. And then you had Brexit, which was extremely traumatic on all parts. I mean, this was a huge development. It carried a lot of costs for both Britain and for the European Union. And I don't think anyone ever wants to see that happen again. And I think the big fear that Europe has is that what happens if Britain comes in and says, right, okay, we want to rejoin, it's taken back in, and then after a few years it says, well, you know what, we made another mistake, we're going to leave. And I think that there is this real sense that that could happen. And so I think there's a real desire amongst European countries that if Britain does say we want to rejoin, then it will be a full member of the European Union. It won't have those exceptions, that it will say, listen, we understand the European project, we agree to the European project in its entirety, and we will sign up to all those elements, including the euro and to Schengen. Personally speaking, again, I've never really quite understood this attitude towards the euro and Schengen. I mean, well, I do sort of understand it, but I certainly don't agree with it. I think the use of the euro, Britain has a very strange relationship with the euro, and there's been all sorts of scaremongering that's been along the way. I live in a country now which uses the euro. It makes life a lot easier for travel. It's great for all sorts of other things. It makes business much easier to do. It allows for much easier access and price comparisons, for example, across the European Union. I mean, there's all sorts of benefits that I think that come from it. And I think that, yes, all right, you can talk about economic disparities, but, you know, this is the same that exists in any large countries which effectively amount to currency union. The same goes for the United States. The same would apply to China. The same would apply to India. This is a regular issue. Countries have areas of considerable economic disparity. You manage it in various ways. And I think the European Union does exactly that. So my sense is that, look, from a strictly legal point of view, you might be right that, that it is there so Britain could ask to have those opt-outs in if it were to ask to rejoin. But my sense that the second it does that, it would send a very, very powerful message that Britain isn't in actual fact ready to rejoin, that it doesn't get, that it needs to be a full-throated member of the European Union, that it really needs to show all those countries that the bad days of the past, where it was demanding all these exceptions, regarding itself as exceptional, are over, and that it would be there and really playing a full role at the heart of the European Union. So in that sense, that yes, as I say, you might be right from a legal point of view, but from a political point of view, I just can't see Britain rejoining if it were to ask for those opt-outs again. Rhapsody in Manx asks, do you think if Moldova seeks closer unity with the European Union or Romania, it could cause the Gagauz to seek greater separation? If so, how would it impact the region? And secondly, could a Gagauz state even survive, considering it's just a series of exclaves on the Ukrainian border? So, for anyone who might not know, so Moldova obviously is sort of squeezed between Ukraine on its eastern border and Romania on its western border. And Moldova is, by and large, it's predominantly sort of Romanian speaking. But you've got these two territories where the population is a little bit different. So one of those, and the one that tends to get a lot more international attention, is an area called Transnistria, which is a long, thin strip of land which sits on the eastern bank of the Dniester River, hence the name Transnistria. And there you've got an interesting mixture that 1/3 of the population would be sort of Moldovan, Romanian speakers, 1/3 would be Russians and Russian speaking, and 1/3 Ukrainian. So it's not quite a simple sort of ethnic conflict as sometimes it's presented. But you have another territory within Moldova to the south, which is called Gagauzia. Now, the Gagauz are a really interesting people because they are Turkic in origin, but they're Orthodox Christian. But for long, complex reasons, even though they have Turkic origins, they are actually been heavily Slavicized, and they actually have very close relations with Russia. So a lot of them will have Russian names and surnames, and a lot will speak Russian. So they were very, very curious people. But what was interesting is that when Moldova broke away from the Soviet Union, became an independent state, you had this war in Transnistria. Gagauzia also tried to break away. And there was an agreement reached that gave Gagauzia considerable autonomy. But within that agreement, there was also a recognition that in the event that Moldova tries and unites with another country, Romania, and there is a body of opinion amongst Moldovans who want to unite with Romania. I've covered this in another video. That then Gagauzia would have the right to determine its own future and potentially become an independent state. So there are two elements to whether this could actually happen. The first is the question: if Moldova tried to unite directly with Romania, then that would seem to be a fairly cut and dry example of when Gagauzia would have that right of self-determination. But the alternative that you painted was what happens if Moldova tries to join the European Union. There, I think we end up in a much more complex position. And there is actually a really interesting precedent to consider on this, which is the case of Cyprus. So when Cyprus applied to join the European Union, it was prohibited under the terms of its independence to have union with Greece or with Turkey. And many argued that by joining the European Union, which Greece was already a member of, then that effectively amounted to some sort of political union with Greece, and that this should be prohibited under the terms of the constitution. But in actual fact, legal scholars looked into this and said, well, no, that doesn't violate the terms. It doesn't amount to a formal political union with Greece, so it's all right. I would suspect that the same would apply in this situation. So if Moldova made a direct attempt to unite with Romania, then maybe we could see the conditions under which this clause would be put into action. But I think if it was about joining the European Union, then I think it's really unlikely that we would see that. I think there's a good case. So the second part of the question is, could a Gagauz state even survive? I mean, you're right in the sense that it is just a collection of enclaves, and I don't think that it would be realistic. And I mean, I was about to say, I think, the obvious answer is EU membership anyway. I mean, I think if Moldova joins the European Union, then that will be good for Moldova. I think it would be very good for the Gagauz. I think that the European Union provides a lot of safeguards for minority communities. I think there would be a lot of money that would be directed towards Gagauzia to help it develop and everything like that. But we have to also accept that Russia has quite a significant influence over it. And so Moscow might see this as a chance to sort of pour in as much resources as it can in order to try and destabilize the situation and push for a Gagauz state. But I think it would be very difficult to see how this would be a viable entity. I mean, never say never. It's not impossible. We have microstates in Europe. But I think that there would probably be a way that would be worked around to encourage Gagauzia to remain part of Moldova and sort of, promise that its autonomy will remain intact. And in fact, in many ways, it probably will gain even greater autonomy, and not just cultural autonomy, but also sort of financial autonomy. The European Union might find ways of sweetening this deal. So I think it's a really, really great question and a very, very interesting situation to watch out for, especially, obviously Moldova is now a candidate for EU membership. So this is actually an issue that does have some significance. Ivan ABC, a channel member, asks, with the right-wing party winning elections in the Czech Republic, how will this affect the EU and war in Ukraine? Great question. I think the fact that we have seen this victory in the Czech Republic is obviously a very worrying sign, but I think maybe not in the way that people might expect. So I've been thinking about this a lot because the Czech Republic, along with Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary, are what we call the V4, the Visegrad 4 members of the European Union. And these are the sort of the major Central European countries that sort of have a close relationship. They've often sort of seen themselves as sharing a lot in common. So, when the European Union enlarged in 2004, you had these different groups. You had the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. You had the V4 that joined. You had Slovenia, which was the first of the former Yugoslav states to join. And then you had Malta and Cyprus, which were the Mediterranean states. So the V4 have been an interesting bloc, and they've often sort of discussed amongst themselves and have a close relationship. And we obviously saw that Poland took a right-wing populist direction. It's now sort of swung back under Prime Minister Donald Tusk, but it had presidential elections and introduced a right-wing figure. But certainly in the case of Viktor Orban in Hungary and Robert Fico in Slovakia, it was very worrying that you had those two governments in power in 2 of the V4 members. And now to see the Czech Republic moving in that direction as well, and the fact that Poland has a right-wing president, are all signs, I think, that people are very worried about, the direction that this group is taking, and they are very influential. I think the one thing that probably, when we're talking about the war in Ukraine, which changes things, is the fact that Poland is historically extremely nervous about Russia. And so I think that even if certain trends are very similar and Poland were to swing back in that direction, I'm not sure that we would see it sort of take a pro-Russian position in the same way that Viktor Orban is clearly very pro-Russian, in the same way that Robert Fico is clearly very pro-Russian, and worrying so, and it can create a lot of turmoil within the European Union. But I do think that it speaks to a much bigger question about the European Union and about the direction that it's taking, and the fact that we are seeing right-wing populism gaining much greater traction in many EU states, and whether this could also be something now that's becoming quite an important dividing line between Western and Central, or Western and Eastern Europe. And I think another thing that I've really been struck by was that, while we think of the V4 in this direction, and we think of what's happening in Hungary, and we think of what's happening in Slovakia, and now the Czech Republic, and potentially Poland, there are other little pockets that we're starting to see. So many might have missed, for example, that the Latvian parliament has just passed a resolution calling on Latvia to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, which is a very, very important convention on women's rights. Now, this came to international attention when Turkey pulled out of the Istanbul Convention, which, ironies of ironies. But it sent a terrible message about the nature of, sort of very regressive views emerging. And, the fact that this is happening in Latvia, I mean, the president has actually just asked the parliament to reconsider it. But I think that this is a very, very worrying sign. And I think this is all tied up with a much bigger problem that we're seeing in Europe about the rise of the populist right and the danger, populist far right, and the dangers that this poses to European unity. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this could have a major impact on the war in Ukraine. I think that there's still enough support elsewhere in Europe for Ukraine that, that problem of Fico and Orban can be overridden, maybe even if it's a question of chucking money at it or at them. But I think more generally, this is something that we do need to be watching out for. And it is a genuine concern because, this starts to eat away at fundamental European values. And, some have said that decision of Latvia, if it's held to stand, would be an incredibly regressive step and might actually stand. I mean, it could. And how it would work is, could this be challenged at the European courts, for example? It opens up a real can of worms, but it's certainly something, this victory of the, in the Czech Republic of Milan Babiš, I think is something that is certainly very, very worrying in the bigger picture of what we're seeing taking place in Europe as a whole. Scott O'Donoghue, 5034, asks, how do academics classify wars? I was always told that there are three types: civil wars, interstate wars, and wars of independence. But people classify the US Civil War as a civil war and it's a war of independence, and classify the Korean War as an interstate war when it's a civil war. Scott, thanks for this question. This touches on, I think, a really important point in how we sort of talk about warfare. And I mean, there are lots and lots of ways of classifying war. I think you can classify wars in terms of their causes. And I would sort of say that, for example, we can talk about wars of ideology, we can talk about geopolitical wars, we can talk about wars of independence, we sort of ethno-national or religious wars and things like that. I take a slightly different view. So I think that, broadly speaking, we can refer to three types of war, and then we can talk about causes of war. And they're a little bit different from each other. Sometimes they map on quite closely, but other times they don't. So I would say that we have civil wars, we have interstate wars, and we have systemic wars. Now, the thing is, to use that term, these are ideal types. So we can say we have the concept of a civil war, which is a war that's fought within a state by different groups. We have an interstate war, which, as it suggests, is fought between countries. Systemic wars, I think, are a little trickier in some ways to define. They're sort of, you sort of know it when you see it. I think, traditionally we talk about the First World War, we talk about the Second World War. To my mind, these are wars which change, as the name suggests, the system. That what you see is a fundamental breaking of what happened in the past and a construction of a new order. And in some ways, this is why sometimes people talk about the First and the Second World War, in actual fact being two parts of a single war that changed the world from the 19th century sort of era through to the post-1945 sort of modern era of international relations. But be that as it may, I think we can regard the First and the Second World War as systemic wars. I think the problem we have is that while you still have traditional civil wars, and we had fewer and fewer interstate wars, but of course interstate wars are now becoming much more prominent. And, we think, especially of the Russia-Ukraine war, I actually think that Russia-Ukraine is what we would call a systemic war. I think that although we could identify as an interstate war, and yes, it is in some ways a classic interstate war, I think that it's much more profound than that. I think that what we're seeing happening in Ukraine has the potential to change the international system. And so for that reason, I tend to regard it in a slightly different way. I think that, as I say, it's a systemic war. And that especially if Russia were to win, and that would then cement the principle that you can change borders by use of force. And I think that would be incredibly dangerous for the international system. Look, again, regular viewers know, I've spoken about this on a number of occasions. But I think even if we sort of say, well, look, we can talk about sort of civil wars, interstate wars, and systemic wars. The other thing to point out is that it's actually quite unusual that you find a pure civil war these days, or a civil war or an interstate war that doesn't have civil elements to it. And I think Ukraine is a really good example of, we could call it a systemic war, we could call it an interstate war, but it also has dimensions of civil war to it. I think that, we can also point out wars that would traditionally fall under the rubric of a civil war, which have interstate elements to it as well. So, for example, a conflict that I covered in quite a lot of detail was the Tigray War in northern Ethiopia, which in actual fact also involved Eritrean troops. But, we can look at other examples. We can talk about, the wars that have taken place in the Congo. About 20 years ago, Congo was marred in a very, very serious war that, in fact, many called Africa's World War because it involved so many African countries. Now, officially, it was an internal war. It was, a civil war, but it had brought in all these outside actors. Does that then make it an interstate war? So I think, it's quite complicated when we talk about wars, because, as I say, you can talk about types of wars, you can talk about causes of war as well. And I think that in many ways what you're talking there is sort of fundamental causes of war, what we would identify as, what is the rationale for this conflict? Whereas, as I say, then you have those types, which is this within a country? Is this between countries? Or is this something that, is much more multifaceted and has that potential to change the system as a whole? Irish mapper Mapsmore says, was there any time that recognition of state was based mostly on the actual situation of control and governance capacity instead of politics? States like Somaliland and Taiwan are not recognised by any state despite fulfilling all the criteria of the Montevideo Convention, while Palestine is recognised by most UN member states despite being divided, partially occupied, without permanent borders or the ability to control its territory. So, look, you raise a really good point. And yes, there was a time when recognition was essentially based on other criteria. So you talk about Montevideo criteria. So for anyone who's not perhaps aware of this, this was laid down in the early 1930s, and it essentially said that to be a state, you need to have a defined territory, a settled population, governance, and the ability to enter into relations with other states. So now we take that as the basis for what we say is, if you meet those criteria, then you can be regarded as a state. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for recognition. In fact, it's not even a necessary condition for recognition, because recognition is a sovereign decision. Any country can choose to recognise part of another country's territory as independent. It's a sovereign decision. But by and large, we sort of say, right, these are the conditions for doing so. But it wasn't always that way. I mean, if you look back, in actual fact, what we had is in the 19th century, we had the principle of de facto recognition. So what that meant was that if a state got to a position where it was abundantly clear that it was no longer under the control of the parent state or the colonial power, and had essentially proved its independent existence, then it should be accepted as an independent state. And this was actually really, really important in the context of South America. And it really emerged out of South America. So again, we could look back and talk about the United States and how that emerged, and how it was accepted by European powers. And that in many ways set the idea of recognition in international relations. It was the first real case of that. But then you had Latin America, and essentially during the Napoleonic Wars, Spain was no longer able to control directly its colonies in South America. They essentially broke away through a series of wars. Spain never accepted it, but Britain and the United States eventually looked at the situation and said, listen, they've proven their independence. They exist as independent states. There's very little likelihood that Spain's going to be able to regain control over them, even though the Spanish government or the Spanish crown won't accept them as independent. They now exist as independent entities, and we will accept them as such. And actually, for most of the 19th century, that was exactly how it was done. And that was really, really important in a number of different cases. So, it also had a very big impact, for example, on the collapse and disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in Southeast Europe, that you had these countries that fought for their independence. And even though, the Ottomans weren't terribly happy about it and refused to accept it, they effectively, even with outside help, managed to become independent and were accepted as such. But that has changed in modern times. So you now have a situation that even if an insurgency group manages to fight its way to control of a territory, with or without outside help, and exist as effectively as independent states, they don't get accepted as such. And I think you sort of raise, a really good example of that. I mean, Somaliland and Taiwan are two very good examples of this. Taiwan's a bit confusing because it hasn't formally declared independence and hasn't formally stated that it wants to be seen as an independent state. But certainly Somaliland has carved itself out as an independent state and exists as an independent state, but Somalia doesn't recognise it. In the 19th century, I think it would have been very clear that Somaliland would have been recognised. But in the late 20th and 21st century, or certainly as things stand at the moment, that doesn't work in the same way. And there is a body of opinion saying that maybe we should move into that area, but it becomes controversial, because does that then encourage warfare? Does that encourage territories to break away with armed force to say, listen, we fought for our independence and we should now be rewarded with it? And I think that there are those who feel very uncomfortable about doing it that way. But yes, I mean, effectively in the 19th century, if you manage to fight your way to independence, then, well done, you've achieved it. But in the current era, that's not the way that things are done. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.